Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Real Estate Development Insights podcast, where we bring you ideas, experiences, and best practices from the real estate development industry. My name is Payam Nursalehi, and I'm your host here. My guest for this episode is Ed Hamzanlui. He is the founder and operator at MassCan Capital, which is a development and development advisory firm in Boston, Massachusetts, in U.S. He is actually our first international guest, for that matter. And so Ed and I met not too long ago through our shared interest in housing and how to deal with the housing crisis. And we've been talking for a while, and I thought that it would be really interesting to see how our neighbors are dealing with the housing crisis and housing affordability, which seems to be, unfortunately, somewhat similar to what we're doing here. So in other words, they seem to have similar issues in Massachusetts to what we are experiencing in Toronto and Ontario and greater part in Canada. And through discussion, it became evident to me that those guys are over there also have some ideas that could be valuable for us to share experience and exchange some knowledge. And that's where this whole episode came about. In this episode, we touch on different initiatives that they're using or different programs that they're using in Massachusetts, in the U.S., south of the border, and trying to create more housing, more affordable housing, and to deal with the similar issues that they have there, like internal migration, like domestic migration from Massachusetts to other areas of the country. We touch about initiatives and programs, like I mentioned. We discussed the missing middle and what their take on it is, how they're approaching the whole missing middle idea, what they call the light touch density, and what their approach is to gateway cities and how they define a gateway city, what they're trying to achieve with these new programs that they have launched, and obviously the fact that there are some transition happening between the old and new administration. There are some uncertainties when it comes to the future of the development and the government programs that are helping these development projects move. We touched briefly on that, and it's an interesting conversation. It's good to know in a way that we're not alone in this mess that we have here north of the border, and in an unfortunate way, but at the same time, they have ideas, we have ideas, and hope things are moving in a better direction. As always, you can find more information about our guest and this episode on our website, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com, realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. That's all one phrase. And if you're enjoying our content and you would like to support our show, please remember to subscribe. That really helps. And also tell others about it. If you have friends or colleagues that you think these topics might be of interest to them, please send them a link. Thank you. And as always, appreciate your support. Hi, Ed. Welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hi, Payam. Doing great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming online. You and I met not too long ago through the brilliant world of social media and through our shared interest on creating housing and being part of the solution. And so it's been a pleasure so far. We've had a few conversations. And why don't we go ahead by introducing you to our audience? Maybe give us a little bit of background. So you run a company called MassCan Capital out of Massachusetts. And by the way, side note, you're our first international guest on this podcast. So hopefully many more to come, but you're the first one. So thank you. And yeah, let's start by giving our audience a little bit of an introduction about yourself.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you, Payam. Thanks for having me. You mentioned international, but I don't see really a major difference between Canada and U.S. regulations. Well, locally, yes, but in general, following the same playbook. We launched MassCan Capital in November 2023, slightly more than a year and 2-3 months ago. And we felt the momentum in Massachusetts. It is already softly touched on that housing is very local. Because at the time I launched MassCan, it started to see some cracks in development and oversupply in some of this market for the last 4 or 5 years in the U.S. market, in Sunbelt, all the way from Southwest Arizona to Texas to Georgia to Florida. At the same time, we've had probably one of the toughest housing situation in Massachusetts.
You have oversupply, but at the same time, you have a tough time in the market.
In another state, another region. You know,
Gotcha.
In Sunbelt region, southern, easier to build. We had plenty supply, good for consumers, but bad for capital and investment in terms of, finding opportunities. At the same time, you are feeling some momentum in some other states like Massachusetts. We felt that. We felt that there is a very, very strong will behind the administration here in Massachusetts and, frankly, entire New England region. Right before that, I was working for a family office-backed housing development in Greater Boston. And the projects that we had on that end didn't go the way we planned originally. So I decided while we were pausing, slowing down on those, we launched MassCan. And I feel the momentum I still do. I'm very bullish on this. Unfortunately, these are not really the same for consumers and builders. Consumers feeling the pain, that creates really a lack of supply. That creates 1 or 2% vacancy. That creates 5, 10, 12, 8% year-over-year rent growth, which is good for investors, but in reality for consumers, that's very painful and creates opportunities. When you look at, 1 or 2% vacancy with a very high demand, and that is funny, zero vacancy across brand new apartments. New construction are close to zero. It's very, very, not very Massachusetts, but in very many markets, you see that. And that's a very promising sign. And you see local municipal that, in my view, is very important that you have that support that want you in the community. They want you to be there. They want you to build whatever you can build. That was not the song until a few years ago. I'm new to Massachusetts, like 3 years old in Massachusetts, but I know for a fact until a handful of years ago, that was not the case. They tell you have to build this, and most of the time, more often than not, you won't be able to build anything. And you end up where we are right now. But a very progressive, seasoned administration right now, in the state level and local level, really created, in my view, a very good opportunity for people who are not afraid of getting messy a little bit. When you build in Massachusetts, very different.
Construction and development is messy by nature. That's
it's
part
messy
of the
by
job,
nature,
right?
but you need to understand building in Dallas, Fort Worth is very different from building in greater Massachusetts. You need to be comfortable with the amount of regulation that's not going to go. There are solutions. It takes you 2 years, maybe 1.5, 2, 3.5, 2.5, 3 years to get the deal shovel ready, comparing some other markets that in a handful of months, you would be ready to start the construction.
And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you, because we have, like it or not, we have a similar situation in Toronto, greater area Toronto, and also parts of Ontario in Canada, where, like you mentioned, some of these projects might take years, like 3 years to get the project from a first initiated idea to a place that you can put the shovel into the ground in 3 years. It's actually not bad. That's how our expectations are formed here. Yeah. And to your point, sometimes you hear a lot of promises, but you can't really build anything because of all these different. One of our previous guests on the podcast put it very well by saying that we have all these sub goals and sub priorities that are competing with each other, which prevent the bigger picture of actually building houses to come to fruition. So it seems like we have at least somewhat similar situation, and that's why I want to have this conversation. And from previous conversations like you and I had, I gather that you think, and like you mentioned so far, you're bullish on the future of this market, what it looks like, and the steps that you've seen happen south of the border. Hey everyone, Payam here. Just a quick announcement before we go back to the rest of the interview. We have been working on something new at midrise.ca. For those of you who have followed my work throughout the years, you know that I'm very passionate about the mid-rise buildings and the part that they can play in solving our housing crisis issues in Toronto and in Canada. And I've had the good fortune and opportunity of working on a number of different mid-rise buildings and study a whole bunch of different systems that work for these buildings, the pros and cons of each system, how they affect the schedule, how they affect the cost, how they affect the performance of each building, and what stages they need to kick in. We have started a new webinar series. It's called Mid-Rise Building Solutions, and we plan to present and review some of the systems that hold the most promise for the mid-rise building typology in each webinar. If you want to learn more, these are all free resources. Please go to our website, midrise.ca. That's mid-rise.ca. And again, thank you for your support.
Exactly. This is when it gets there, the situation got so serious that, in my view, the elected officials woke up to the fact that we are losing population for basic fact. People move. They cannot afford living here. And yeah, in the stats, we are using 30% of the income for housing, but in reality, that's much higher than that for most of the people. And that really drives people making decisions where to live. We have a job center in Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts, gonna go anywhere, but there is a threshold. There is a point that if you reach that breaking point, people say, you know what, whatever, I accept that job in Austin or Atlanta that pays 30% less, but my housing cost is 50% less. And they move.
Mhm.
And it's happening. It's been happening for a while. And it got to a point that I believe elected officials woke up to the fact that we are losing population. We are kind of stable at the time for the past couple of years, but that is mostly because of the immigration. The
Right.
domestic migration is negative for Massachusetts. It is simple. We should not really confuse a couple of big factors, strategies, policies here. People say, hey, let's deregulate. Regulation is not easy. Regulation happens for a reason. I'm not a fan of that, but when you grow, the larger you get, the more regulation comes with it. This is the nature.
Mhm.
And some of the easier markets to build just started the growth phase in their lives. That's why they're very light and easy to build.
Right.
Just wait for another 10, 15, 20 years and you see what happens. Because that's the nature, that's the process when you get there. When you build in New York or Massachusetts or some of these states, you're the oldest states in the US, and some of the laws exist for more than 200 years. And that's where we are. However, some of them are unnecessary. Some of them are coming from very personal or unsophisticated places. People started adding stuff to this regulation that were unnecessary or were pretty much uneducated. They did not really. I don't want to get into details. Some of the politics, it might not be the best place for the podcast, but there are some very common concepts that failed. They came up
Right.
with affordability requirement, this and that, and all of a sudden you ended up with no units whatsoever.
Right. And to your point, I think that's part of the nature of the beast. I can also say in Toronto and Ontario here, we have bylaws in our zoning bylaws and regulations that go back 50, 60, 70 years ago. And they were put in place for certain time period that they had its use, successful or not. I'm not that involved to be able to comment on that. But you can tell that and even in prior conversations with prior guests, it has come up that some of them basically need to be rethought, or you need to think about them again and figure out, is this the best way of doing this? And again, this is interesting for me because it seems like you guys are suffering pretty much from the same situation that we have here, which so Toronto and Ontario is the hub and is one of the power centers, if not the power center in Canada. And we have been losing population. It started with Toronto getting out of Toronto by driving out a couple hours here and there, but now other provinces and other areas of the country are picking up overflow from Toronto because it's really unaffordable. It has become very unaffordable in terms of housing. And with that being said, I know when you and I were talking, you had particularly mentioned that there are 2 or 3 programs that I can't remember if it was the state government or the municipalities are launching, which you think are kicking it in. And I'm really hoping we can dive into those programs or initiatives, and maybe we can take away a few lessons from what you guys are doing over there, see if we can improve the situation north of the border. Can you maybe walk us through those?
Absolutely. I'm sure there are even then sophisticated and experienced people that listening to your podcast than me. Just to those people that my comments might
We're in
not
the
be
business of sharing insights and experiences, so any insight and experience
exactly
is welcomed.
exactly a couple of points here and there. One of the more recent regulation in terms of building more housing that we've been passing here in different cities and counties in Massachusetts is MBTA Act. MBTA communities is Massachusetts Bay Authority Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. That kind of came up with this whole regulation or act, basically, to by law allow permit building housing, giving density required more than the existing zoning to cities and counties identified as a MBTA community. They're having access to train or some bus or with some, factors that they filtered. And many communities were identified as MBTA communities. And within half a mile or mile of those stations, it gets a little bit tricky about, which parcel of land would be qualified for this or not. It really gets to like the door opens up, like it really gets that detail. But in general, it allows, it permits as of right building density 15 units minimum per acre for those parcels around that those transportation hubs in MBTA community. And it has been very controversial in terms of some of the counties, you believe or not, did not pass that. Basically, reject to comply with the requirement of this act.
Sorry, just to recap. So this is a statewide regulation that has kicked in, and the state is enforcing it on all counties and all municipalities. Did I get it right?
Correct. Those counties and cities or communities that they identified as MBTA. Because they want to, at the same time, they want to encourage housing, but the other part of the mission is housing around public transportation, right? But you know what? We don't want to build more highways or this and that. We just want to encourage people to live around this public transportation so they can move easily without adding more to the traffic. And that's a very rational thinking. And I don't think we were the first people thought about that. But I was surprised that's a no-brainer. Why you don't want to do that? If you have a train station that goes from 70 miles to Boston, you should allow building multifamily in like walking distance from that, right? It is a no-brainer. And you would be surprised to find out that some of the communities actually rejected that. They don't want that.
Oh, what's the reason? Do you know?
Right now, one was last week, 2 weeks ago. I saw on the news on Friday, the other one. There are a handful of communities that rejected that. And since there are some strings attached to this act, I don't know the details, frankly, but some of the funding and grants and source of financing that goes to those communities, hey, if you do not approve this, you're not going to get the funding. And
it's almost the state forcing their hand to do what they wanted to do. Right.
I would say most of them, my projects, the communities I am working, they are all passed that months ago. They never had a problem with that. But there are Milton, for example, is the famous case here. Milton here, there was another one I've heard over the weekend that they said no, they rejected that. And they are in court right now because they're suing the state sued them. It's going to be a long battle, but very successful. I would say maybe more than 95%, 90% of communities adopted this. So in my view, that's a very promising move. However, approving or accepting or permitting this doesn't translate to more housing. You just allow those land parcels to be built a certain amount of density or higher. That doesn't mean people can go tomorrow and start building. That's a whole different game. But at least you remove one of the obstacles they've had. You don't have to go to 5 years of public hearings, this and that. And
it facilitates the process, right? Even right now. So it's interesting. And I don't know the timing of it. So I don't know if Massachusetts was first or Ontario was first. Because even in Ontario recently, and I want to say in the past year or so, we've had this regulation kick in, which is around the major transit areas. And it's pretty much almost exactly what you were describing, that if you're within, I believe it's 800 meters of a subway station or a transit station major area, you get certain allowances in terms of intensification and incentives to create more housing. But to your point, even from our previous guest on the podcast, the one, and I think it was Josh Kaufman who mentioned that what it does, none of these individually will be acting as a magic bullet. None of them would do that. But they will create more alignment, which hopefully through time will help the developers to have a better chance of actually succeeding. Because as we were just talking, development as a whole is a messy business. If you're in development and if you ever dealt with a development project or a construction business, there are many unknowns, many risks involved that you really don't know until you get into it. And the timelines obviously don't help. It just hurts that, like makes that aspect more risky, if you may. So to agree with you, I think we're going through a similar situation over here. I don't think individually that regulation will solve or majorly affect or majorly improve our situation, but it's one of many that can do.
Exactly. That's a very good, a strong step toward the right direction. Let's put it that way. Another one that I personally am using in one of our projects, you said, again, I believe in 2010, they identified 26 cities. Numbers might be a little bit here and there, but in 2010, they identified 26 cities. They called them gateway cities. Mm-hmm. Mid-sized, relatively older industrial cities that back in the days in 1800s or early 1900s. They're very active, powerful.
Right.
But the industrial, I don't call it industrial revolution, but the shifting in industrial pattern production in Massachusetts just moved some of those industries to other cities, to some other state regions, sometimes international recently. And that left some of those very strong communities basically without that pump, without that energy economy that they used to have. And over the past 6, 7, 8 decades, they lost that glory and slowed down. Massachusetts came up with this program way before the time that I was in Massachusetts. They called them gateway cities. And some interesting, they advocate within those gateway cities, they recognize some areas they identify and they call them HDIP zoning, housing district, and putting an overlay over the existing zoning. Mm-hmm. And what is very interesting is that those HDIP allows you to build multifamily as of right, has to be market rate, not affordable.
Market rate.
Not affordable. When you quickly look at it, that sounds very counterintuitive with all the actions in the affordable housing. But that's a very intelligent move because those markets are suffering, struggling, right? And they are already affordable. The market rate is already affordable. So the intention is to bring in consumers, to bring in people that having decent jobs, they pay taxes, they have discretionary expenses that they can go out and spend and generally contribute to those markets, gateway markets, instead of just focusing on housing. While the housing is just the market is already affordable because of other factors. It's a very intelligent, move they had, and they removed, you can get in and out of planning board in a few months, very quick approval process and a market rate development. However, if you want to get a little bit technical on that, the rents you underwrite for those type of markets usually, most of the time, do not pencil. Like, unfortunately, with all these regulations and programs that they go to those cities, you don't see a lot of activities. Mm-hmm. But again, another good, right, intelligent move, action from the people who understood how to address one size doesn't fit all. Different communities have different needs. But in my view, that was a very interesting.
So let me get this right. So you're saying that these were cities or communities that are within, I think you mentioned gateway cities. Correct. So they were not necessarily a hub themselves, but close to a major hub, technological setup of the country or a state. They have been declining. So someone comes there and said, listen, these are not very expensive rents as it is. The rent in this market is reasonable, but you're probably, my guess is, and I'm just going to go out on a limb here, that you were lacking in good stock, meaning you probably had very old buildings that no one wanted to really move into, that probably possibly didn't have enough interest and would not be enough interesting enough for new outsiders to come in and move to those cities. So I'm just trying to think, would the idea have been, okay, we have remote workers who, instead of living in Boston, could go there and set up in a nice community, small one, and the rate is fair enough that we don't need to push the rate, but you can give them proper housing in a proper community. Does that sound
You
about
hit
right?
the nail on the head. That's exactly it. We have a housing district zoning, as the name says, but the core of this program is actually for the community and bringing population in, generating revenues for any type of business, generating tax income for the city. And it is banking on those aspects of that by creating affordable housing, which is market rate, bringing people in to bring new life,
Right.
to basically encourage, advocate the economic progress.
So it's interesting if you transpose these two together. Like we just talked about two very different initiatives, and it seems like they came into effect at the same time, or relatively at the same time, and they are happening right now. So on one end, you're saying you had, like, if I get it right, you had the MBTA Act, which basically says if you have a transit hub in an urban setting, let's intensify. If you need, for whatever reason, that's how I'm interpreting these changes, is that if you, for whatever reason, need to be in urban setting, need to be downtown in a CBD, somewhere where the action is high, why we don't want you to go and have to drive 40 minutes or 30 minutes with a car and get on a highway. Just come in, stay close to a transit hub. Let's intensify that. Let's utilize that to the extent of it. And on the other end of the spectrum now, if you don't need to be in the CBD, if you don't need to be in a hustling, bustling area of the cities, not move away an hour, drive a 70 miles or kilometers or whatever, and go into an older community which has the space, they have the infrastructure, and we're going to give you good stock housing, which you can live there, you can raise a family there, and also work remotely. I might be fantasizing this, but that's what I'm reading between the lines.
No, you probably the first session they had about these regulations 20 years ago. You talked about exactly what you said. It came from that place that, yes, let's encourage people that they only need to be, I don't know, in proper Boston, maybe 2 days a week, but they can drive. Massachusetts, Eastern Massachusetts in general, is not that big, really. It's small. If you look at the map, it's really, you can get from anywhere to anywhere in 2 hours if you want. 1 hour is an average drive. But create some communities that people want to live. And one of the good characteristics about Massachusetts in general is a beautiful state. It is important. It is important. I lived in Midwest. I lived in Chicago, my favorite city. I love Chicago. But outside of Chicago, really, not much is happening.
But sorry, I have to make a note here that Toronto, Ontario is beautiful, and I bet you that we can go toe to toe on that. So I just want to make sure that I said that on the record.
Well, wonderful. But for example, if you step out of some of these major cities, there is nothing happening for hours or hundreds of miles. Massachusetts is not like that. It's a very small, very old community and beautiful. Different cities with different personality, culture, history, and you would be surprised how much history some of these towns have. So they have a lot to offer. They do. Mm-hmm. And they are not like those boring coastal cities. They're really wonderful places to live. But they recognize that, and they design these programs to give some incentives to people to get out of Boston a little bit, save maybe 40, 50% on their rent. If they need to go to Boston, maybe 1 or 2 days a week. And you don't have to. Some of these cities actually slowly becoming the hub. Some other companies. Give you an example. Amazon. You've probably heard of them.
I think so. Sounds familiar.
They built the largest logistic hub here in a city, Fall River, which I have a project in Fall River. And I tell people that I'm sure Amazon knows what it does. They're looking at the access, the ports, the job, the talent pool, all of this stuff. And at the same time, they factor in all of those very, very comprehensive details data sets they have and they decide where to build. They put that relatively outside of Boston in the city of Fall River, which is like 50, 60, 70 miles outside of Boston on the border of Rhode Island. The coastal city. It's an old industrial city and next to the water, so it has access to all those ports and also major highways. And on the corridor to Providence and New York, we call that 95 corridor goes. So some of these larger companies that are in different businesses, but they recognize the pattern that not as often, but you see some of them are doing some major investments in those cities as well. And you've heard of that probably. I don't know if that's the case today, but a few years ago, smaller multifamily investors that wanted to buy properties, one of the factors they used to look was the Starbucks. If there's a Starbucks around, we would go because everybody believed the Starbucks has a proper analysis, market analysis, very exactly to put the location and said, hey, someone already done the job.
Let's follow the coffee.
The coffee, exactly.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting because you're right. Like we have the same situation. I want to go back to what we were just talking because I need to wrap my own head around this. In Toronto, we use this expression, or I guess saying that the city has been built in GTA, a Greater Toronto area has been built in a tall or sprawl situation, meaning we have 100-story buildings in downtown Toronto, 80 stories, and there's no shortage of them. And there's going to be more and more and more, which have shoebox-sized condos, which I've had the pleasure of living in before. And then all of a sudden, then you have 30, 40-kilometer drives, and you go to these suburbs, and that you keep the suburbs and keep growing and sprawling out. And the recent trend in the planning and the regulation here has been try to bridge the gap, what we call the missing middle, trying to go for mid-rise buildings, trying to go for something that you don't have to drive as far out and you don't need to go as much high. So you go in the like a more central locations and do a 6-story building, do an 8-story building, right? Do you see any of that action happening in Massachusetts? Is there any thoughts trying to promote that type of building over there?
I'm so happy you brought that up. The missing middle, whatever. There are quite a few names that going for that. And that's a very genius idea, in my view, thanks to some people at AEI, at Pinto, that advocated and really polished that idea because it is a very easy idea or program to sell to local people, unsophisticated people to understand that. At the same time, it has the potential to really make an impact. I'm assuming your audiences know about this program, but I quickly
walk us through it, maybe.
Yeah, quickly cover that in a very simple way. For example, assuming that the requirement for single family in an area was 20,000 square foot per lot. I'm sorry, I'm using imperial.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine.
But half an acre.
We use square feet here for houses as well.
Wonderful. For example, half an acre, 20,000, 25,000 square foot per unit. That was, for example, in one city, in one location was a requirement. And that was appropriate in 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago in 60s, 70s. And people drive and, everybody had a nice 2,200 square foot single family, 4 or 5 kids, and everything was fine. Time changed, right?
Yeah.
Family sizes shrank, people lifestyle shrink, furniture sizes, people get married later, people don't have as many kids, a lot of factors. So people really don't need as much space. However, the value of those lands gone up, and the construction inflation almost always ahead of consumers' income. That's the trend. The value of those assets, proper real estate property, is always ahead of people's income on average. And it got us to a position that not many people need nor can afford those big houses. And the population that we have compared to 30, 40 years ago. They came up with these ideas that we have already cities built houses. What about instead of we go 80 floors high? And then next to that, 5-10 miles away, we have these communities that there are one house sitting on 1 acre or half an acre or 2 acres in some cases. what about we create this middle housing? What is middle housing? Said, hey, let's get one of those single families sitting on a 30,000 square foot a lot. And instead of going vertical or whatever, creating 20 or 30 houses, just make 2 or 4, or the same footprint, a little bit different, but we convert 1 to 2 or 4. Very light touch density. The other term that they are using, light touch density.
Light touch density.
Yeah, light touch density. And let's create that. And that is not going to be noticeable to many people who are living in that communities. Because if you look at it, the family size is from 8 now gone to 2. But again, if you multiply it by 2 or 3, you're still at 6. So really, the design around highways and traffic not going to be that different. And also, you don't really make massive changes in the pattern and the build of the community. It's much easier to sell. Some cities, I know Tennessee, Nashville adopted that. They have this missing middle housing, which is light touch density going from 1 to 4 or 2, something like that. Minneapolis, Minnesota also adopted. It is a hot topic here in Massachusetts. It is a very hot topic as of right now that we record this. We don't have any regulation for that. We have MBTA. Again, we are pretty busy with MBTA already.
Right.
So one step at a time. But that is a very practical. That's a super practical minimum impact. So you can make a lot of people happy.
It's like you said. I like that phrase, light touch density, because it's one end of this, right? For the longest time, the development community and the developers have been considered as the evil developer who's going to come in, rip and tear apart the fabric of a community, build a lot of money for themselves, and just take off, right? But what we have been seeing in Toronto, and I can say that with great respect for the officials and whoever is doing this, because I'm very positive and I'm seeing a lot of good progress happening here, is that we recently, over the past couple of years, we've had what we call here a multiplex regulation, which basically is very similar to light touch. What you're saying, if you have a single family house, it's a detached, and there are certain criteria obviously you need to follow, but you could go from 1 residence to 4 if you follow those regulations. It's very new. We're still on the learning curve. We did a full episode of podcast on it, and we went through the nuances of this regulation, but it's very helpful. Hypothetically, once it gets rolling, it converts a lot of the city into from a 1-family dwelling to a 4-family dwelling, which could solve a lot of issues. And on top of that, I think it was back in 2012, the City of Toronto introduced the mid-rise guidelines, which was basically saying you can build certain avenues in City of Toronto, which call a quote-unquote avenue, qualify for, and you can build mid-rises with certain guidelines up to 6 or 8 stories, which was governed mainly by the width of the right-of-way, how wide the street was. And they've taken that through another regulation recently on what they call a major street, which on a major street right now, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly at the time, we're going 60 units and 6 stories, right? So all of these combined are moving in the right direction. These are, like you said, I think you mentioned it earlier in the conversation, that the officials are waking up and saying, guys, we need to do something. Like in Canada and Ontario, we're losing population to Alberta, but no disrespect to Alberta, but I like my friends to stay in Toronto. I like my friends to stay in Ontario. But with that being said, I wanted to switch back to the initiatives. I remember you mentioning something about mass housing in Massachusetts.
Correct.
Maybe walk us through that. Is that another initiative that you found helpful?
Mass housing is actually the name of the co-organizations here that is in affordable housing, capital A affordable housing. We have mass housing that is basically helping with different type of tax credit and different type of affordable housing financing. That's, in other words, that's affordable housing financing organization, mass housing here. There is another organization, Mass Development, that the focus is not housing, but they do housing too. There's MHP MassCan Housing Partnership, there's MHEC MassCan Housing Initiatives Corporation. There are quite few organizations that if you want to get into the weeds of affordable housing in Massachusetts, it takes a while to figure out who does what. Yes.
So the reason I want to talk about it, because I think, and I could be wrong, I think it somewhat parallels what CMHC does in Canada. And I'm going to elaborate by saying that it feels to me, and I don't know enough about the topic by any means, but it feels like in what I'm hearing from you is that over there, the state is taking the charge, the main one who's taking the charge and trying to push all these initiatives. Whereas in Canada, it seems to me like how, and that's a good thing, that we have on all three levels of the government, which is the federal, the provincial, and the municipal, because we have CMHC, which is a crown corporation, which is basically all over Canada, which provides financing for many of these affordable housing, purpose-built rental. You meet certain criteria. I've heard of cases that they would fund your project up to 93% of the entire hard cost would come from them with very favorable terms and conditions on your financing. And then when we have some regulations at provincial level, like we discussed in terms of major transit hubs, and then we have municipal regulations such as the multiplexes and the major streets and avenues and mid-rise guidelines and so on and so forth, right? Am I correct in that over there is the state who's taking the lead on these things?
Correct. Yes. We have federal programs, but at the state level, one state organization would usually manage that funding. But you are correct. They are almost always state and might not be state funded. It would be federal funding, but it's still those state organizations manage the funding and the distribution and asset management.
Right. So it's good to know. Maybe we should have touched this early on in the conversation, but it's not too late. So you're a developer yourself. You have your own projects that you're developing on with your partners and your setup, and then you also perform and provide development services for other people as a consultant or as a development manager. And what do you see coming up next? Like we talked about some of the initiatives, some of the programs. Obviously, it seems like things are moving in the right direction. Do you know of, or do you see, or can you foresee any other programs, initiatives coming up in the near future?
That's a very good question. That's a very loaded question. We are just coming out of an election season. Right. So, and many ideas were tossed around, it is common. It's the election season and people coming up with different types of ideas. What we have cooking right now, it is very positive. And the people, well-intended people who actually felt the pain and woke up, got the message, are in charge. So for the next few years, that is going really to move forward. Let me take a step back here. Let me pause here for a second. We can do whatever we want, but in the U.S., in the States at least, we are a capital-driven, we are a capitalism. And real estate in particular is a very rate-sensitive industry. Mm-hmm. Very rate sensitive. On a mortgage side that you are tied to 10-year treasury, on a construction side that you are tied to federal fund rating, is a very rate sensitive, really tied to capital market. So let's go back to our conversation, keeping that in mind. Now we have all these great programs that making it easier to go to the pre-development and get a program that you want and get approved and penciled. But at the end of the day, you also need the capital market to bring in the fund that you need to build that. It would be any type of equity or debt, different type of instruments that you can use for construction, for development, but to keep it simple as a debt and equity. So equity, depending on what type of equity you use, that might prefer it's a mandate from organization, institution that want to invest in your project, or a smaller fund that they don't have any mandate, it just chase return. On the debt side, on a construction, basically, I'm not talking about a mortgage. I'm talking about the construction period. On the construction debt side, usually the biggest lenders are local banks. And those local banks usually follow some guideline from Federal Reserve in terms of the balance sheet, the liquidity requirement. So the rate alone is not the only factor. And that's really a major part, macro side of real estate development, aside from everything that we spoke about today. We can fix everything and create a very active environment.
So basically what you're saying is that you can change all the laws you want, but if the numbers don't work, they don't work.
They don't work. Exactly. And it's a free market. Capital flows wherever. And
you can incentivize it and you can facilitate and you can even put the red carpet down. But if the numbers don't work, they don't work, which is unfortunately, we experience the same thing here in Toronto as well. Like even with all the great stuff that all three levels of the government have been doing through the regulation and incentives, still when you run the pro forma on an 8-story building, it's really, really, really hard to make it work unless you have the proper scale and you've bought the land for a certain price. But if you want to start from scratch right now, to your point, that the money doesn't work. Like we have had some good movements here, and maybe here's us sharing with you some of the ideas that have been working in Toronto. Is that the government came out, I think about 2 years ago now, and they removed the basically sales tax or value add tax or HST on the purpose-built rental buildings with certain requirements, which has basically been the difference between viability and non-viability of a project, because some of these projects, these numbers can add up. It could be in the area of 5 to 10 million on the jobs on a project. And so that has been good. But to your point, the numbers need to work. The numbers
need to work. There are, for example, in the Trump first administration, they passed opportunity zone that the current Michael Turner administrator, who was the person actually worked on that opportunity zone. So many people are positive about he's becoming the head of HOT, housing and urban development. But like this kind of, for example, opportunity zone, very close to what you said in Canada. Mm-hmm. There are a few pieces here and there that are very helpful. But in my view, I believe there is a general awakening to the fact of American dream and homeownership.
Right.
And what we used to build, as we discussed in details, 2,400 square foot houses are not affordable, you're not desirable, you're not needed as much as they used to. And now we need to shift our gears to the more applicable, more affordable, and more proper for our current generation. And I believe in general, that would be one of the themes. Let people build smaller units, townhouses, or whatever structure, short or mid-rise, and the semi-suburb, not fully suburb, but not fully urban either. Mm-hmm. And, get some light touch density. And that goes a long way. I can promise you, I personally can't pencil a lot of those deals. I can't. If I am promised that if I go through the approval process, I can get the density I want, I can put 8 units or 10 units, 20 units per acre, I can make them work. And there is demand out there. There is a huge demand because most of the people can afford to buy them, and they would be a homeowner. And there are smaller units, so your utility, property taxes, all those stuff would be very manageable.
It's about finding that sweet spot, like you said.
Exactly.
And you don't need as big, but you also don't want to go for a shoebox.
Exactly. I believe there is a lot of attention to this missing middle right now for good. Since people started to understand, okay. And some regulation we would see on that, mostly on the regulation and zoning. You don't need a lot of market support for that, a lot of government monetary support for that. You do not. A lot of incentive subsidies.
You basically start loosening up the red tape a little bit, and let like you said, let the market forces do what they
build that. Yeah, market can build those units. I know the numbers for those units in Massachusetts and almost anywhere in the U.S. that there is an interest from people to live in those cities. You can build them and you can pencil them. But it is just not available as of right. And it is hard to go, you have 2 acres land, you might be able to build 3 units, and now you need to build 35 units. So it is not an easy battle. Although you give units to people that a third of the cost of those mega mansions, and many people can afford that. But I believe there is a focus on that.
That's good. Thank you, Ed. This has been really interesting conversation. I'm hoping that we can have a similar conversation in a year or two and have even more good news in terms of progress that has been made at both sides of the border. And hopefully we've managed to put a dent in this whole housing crisis and affordability crisis. It's a good place to be. A lot of good things happening. At some point, I was personally questioning if there was a will to do that, but it seems like the will is coming, or it's at least showing itself more recently. Thank you very much. Is there anything I haven't asked you, or do you have any final thoughts before we part here?
What you just said, I share the same opinion about housing in general. There is a housing problem brewing for the last 10, 20 years, since 90s, 80s, 90s. And in early 2000s and today, it is really at the peak. So it got a lot of attention. Usually don't hear from the podium of presidential election that both candidates talk about it a lot. When you start hearing that, that means the message got through. And because of that reason, we are going to see a lot of movements on that sector for the next 5, 10 years, 15 years. If you are a practitioner, you want to do this, it's a good sector to be. We cannot guarantee anything for 10, 15, 20 years down the road. Nevertheless, this sector, but for the next 5, 10, 15 years, it would be a lot of activities in my view, and good for consumers at the same time. Tenants, for investors or people that are engaged in this, and also the consumers now, they would have more options, more affordable options.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your presence on the show, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Just one last thing before you leave. We've created a document called Real Estate Development Toolbox, which you can download for free from our website at realestatedevelopmentinsights.com. This document is basically the result of us asking our network and our listeners, what is a top tool that you use on a daily basis to keep yourself aware of information that's going on in the industry, the changes, the trends, the technologies, the regulations, and or if you, with the tools that you use to make sure that you deliver quality results to your clients and customers, the tools that help you with productivity in what you do, and also any softwares, specialized softwares that you think are useful to share with others. So if you think there are resources that you're using on a daily basis and you would like others to know about them, please make sure to let us know, and we will make sure to include it in the next iteration of this toolbox. Thank you very much, and I hope you find this document useful.